A faded photograph sits in a municipal archive box in the American Midwest. At first glance it looks ordinary. A city street. Wide sidewalks. People in hats waiting calmly along a curb. But running through the center of the street is something that feels strangely unfamiliar to modern eyes. Steel rails. And beside them, a long electric streetcar painted in muted cream and green, its windows open to the summer air while passengers step on and off with quiet routine. The photograph is dated 1925. What makes it unusual is not the technology, nor the crowd. It is the silence of something missing. Because the street in the photograph contains no traffic jam. No exhaust clouds. No endless rows of private automobiles. Instead, the city appears to move together, carried by a shared system of electric transit that once stretched through hundreds of American cities. Clean. Frequent. Remarkably efficient. By the early 20th century, these electric streetcar networks had become the circulatory system of urban America. Millions of passengers rode them every day. Neighborhoods grew around their lines. Entire cities organized their daily rhythm around the quiet hum of electric motors gliding along steel tracks. And then, within just a few decades, the rails began to disappear. Tracks were ripped from the pavement. Streetcars vanished. Gasoline buses arrived in their place. To later generations, the change would appear almost natural. Progress, perhaps. The inevitable rise of the automobile age. But buried deep in federal court records from the late 1940s is a different story entirely. A story involving oil companies, tire manufacturers, and one of the most powerful automobile corporations in the world. And a criminal case that quietly suggested the transformation of American transportation might not have been an accident at all. The story does not usually begin with a courtroom. It begins with a feeling. A quiet assumption repeated across generations, that American cities were always meant to revolve around cars. Wide highways. Endless parking lots. Suburbs spreading outward like ripples from a stone. But the photograph in that archive box suggests something else. Because in the early decades of the 20th century, the United States possessed one of the most extensive urban transit systems on Earth. Electric streetcars ran through Los Angeles, Chicago, St. Louis, Baltimore, Cleveland, and hundreds of smaller cities in between. Some systems carried tens of millions of passengers every year. The vehicles were powered by overhead electric wires. They moved efficiently through dense neighborhoods. They required no gasoline. No individual ownership. In many cities, a person could cross the entire urban landscape without ever touching a steering wheel. Then something curious begins to appear in historical records. In city after city, transit companies that had operated for decades began to collapse. Lines were suddenly sold. Operators were replaced. Streetcars were retired. At first the explanation seemed simple. Many officials believed the technology had merely grown old. Automobiles were becoming popular. Buses seemed flexible. They did not require rails embedded in streets. But when researchers later began comparing municipal records across different regions, the pattern started to look less random. Transit systems in Los Angeles. Transit systems in Oakland. Transit systems in Baltimore. Different cities. Different decades. Yet the ownership of many of these failing streetcar networks seemed to pass through the hands of the same company. A company with an unusual name. National City Lines. At the time, it presented itself as a transportation holding company. Its business model appeared straightforward: acquire struggling urban transit systems and modernize them. The modernization always followed a similar script. Electric streetcars were removed. Tracks were dismantled. New fleets of gasoline-powered buses replaced them. And those buses were built by a very specific manufacturer. Their tires came from a very specific supplier. And the gasoline fueling them came from a very specific oil company. Individually, none of these connections seemed particularly suspicious. Corporations often partnered with one another. Industrial supply chains were nothing new. But when federal investigators began mapping the relationships behind national city lines during the 1940s, a different picture slowly emerged. Behind the holding company stood a cluster of powerful investors. General Motors. Standard Oil of California. Firestone Tire. Companies whose fortunes were deeply connected to a future built around automobiles, gasoline, and rubber tires. The question investigators eventually asked was not simple. But it was unavoidable. Were these corporations merely investing in transit companies during a period of technological change? Or had something more deliberate been unfolding beneath the surface of American transportation? By the late 1940s, the question had grown large enough that it reached a federal courtroom. For decades, the electric streetcar had been an ordinary part of American life. Not a novelty. Not an experiment. A system. By the early 1900s, thousands of miles of steel track threaded through American cities. Electric power flowed through overhead wires, feeding quiet motors that pulled streetcars from neighborhood to neighborhood. Workers rode them before dawn. Shop owners relied on them to bring customers downtown. Entire suburbs emerged along the routes, their streets designed around walking distance to the nearest stop. The system was not perfect. But it was everywhere. Streetcar companies often operated as private utilities, regulated by city governments and bound by long-term franchise agreements. They were required to maintain tracks embedded in public streets. They had to provide frequent service. In many cities they were even obligated to charge a fixed 5-cent fare, a rule that had been established decades earlier when electricity and maintenance costs were very different. At first, the arrangement seemed stable. But by the 1920s and 1930s, the pressures surrounding these transit systems began to change. Cities were growing. Automobiles were appearing in greater numbers, sharing the same streets as the streetcars. Congestion slowed the vehicles that once moved freely along their routes. Meanwhile, the companies operating these networks struggled under regulations that made it difficult to raise fares or adjust services to new economic conditions. Maintenance costs increased. Tracks wore down. Electrical infrastructure aged. Vehicles required replacement. In many places, transit companies found themselves trapped in a difficult position. They were responsible for maintaining large physical systems embedded directly into the streets, yet their revenue remained limited by long-standing fare caps and public expectations. Some cities attempted reforms. Others simply watched the systems weaken. And it was during this moment of vulnerability that a new type of company began appearing in the transportation landscape. Holding companies. Organizations designed not to operate a single transit line, but to acquire multiple systems across different cities. By purchasing struggling transit companies, these groups claimed they could modernize operations, reduce costs, and bring urban transportation into a new era. National City Lines was one of them. Formed in the 1930s, it began quietly purchasing transit systems throughout the United States. Each acquisition followed a similar pattern. Investors stepped in. Ownership changed hands. New management promised efficiency. Then the transformation began. Streetcars were gradually retired. Rails were removed from the pavement. Electric infrastructure was dismantled. In their place appeared fleets of gasoline-powered buses that required no tracks and far less fixed infrastructure. To city officials facing maintenance costs and aging equipment, the shift often seemed practical. Flexible routes. Lower upfront expenses. A sense of modernization. Yet as investigators would later examine the financial structure behind National City Lines, they discovered that the company itself did not stand alone. Its funding came from a network of corporate partners. General Motors provided buses. Firestone supplied tires. Standard Oil supplied fuel. Each piece of the new transportation model depended on the others. And across city after city, the same transformation unfolded. Electric streetcar systems vanished. Gasoline buses replaced them. Individually, each decision could be explained by economics or technological change. But taken together, the pattern raised an uncomfortable possibility. What if the transition from electric streetcars to gasoline buses was not simply the result of changing technology? What if it had been guided, quietly, systematically, by companies that stood to benefit from a transportation system built around cars, fuel, and rubber? By the mid-1940s, federal investigators began looking closely at that question. In the archives of the U.S. Department of Justice, the paper trail begins quietly. Not with dramatic headlines. Not with sweeping accusations. Just documents. Contracts. Investment records. Internal correspondence. Individually, each piece looked mundane. Corporations investing in transportation companies was nothing unusual in the industrial economy of the 1930s and 1940s. American business was filled with partnerships, joint ventures, and supply agreements. But when investigators began assembling the documents together, the relationship started to form a pattern that was difficult to ignore. National City Lines was not simply buying transit systems. It was buying them with money from companies whose products would replace the very technology being removed. One record revealed capital flowing from General Motors, the largest automobile manufacturer in the country. Another showed investment from Standard Oil of California, a company whose profits depended on gasoline consumption. Another traced financing back to Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, one of the dominant producers of vehicle tires. These corporations did not merely invest. They also became suppliers. When a streetcar system was purchased by National City Lines, the transition often followed a familiar sequence. Electric cars that had run on rails for decades were gradually retired. Tracks were torn out of the pavement. Maintenance facilities were redesigned. Overhead power lines disappeared. Then fleets of buses arrived. The buses were frequently manufactured by General Motors. Their tires came from Firestone. Their engines ran on gasoline supplied by Standard Oil. On paper, the arrangement could still appear efficient. Buses required less infrastructure than streetcars. They could change routes easily. Cities struggling with aging track systems might reasonably choose a cheaper alternative. Yet the federal investigators noticed something unusual. In many of the acquisition agreements, the new transit companies were required to purchase buses, fuel, and tires specifically from the corporate investors behind National City Lines. The supply chain was not incidental. It was built directly into the contracts. This meant that when a city's electric streetcars were replaced with gasoline buses, three industries benefited simultaneously: automobile manufacturing, petroleum production, and tire manufacturing. Meanwhile, the electric systems that had once dominated urban transportation quietly vanished. Between the late 1930s and the mid-1940s, dozens of transit networks passed through the hands of National City Lines and related companies such as Pacific City Lines. Los Angeles, Oakland, Baltimore, St. Louis, and other cities experienced similar transitions. Rails removed. Streetcars scrapped. Buses deployed. At first, these changes drew little national attention. To most residents, the transformation simply looked like modernization. But by the mid-1940s, federal antitrust investigators began asking whether the pattern was merely business strategy, or something closer to coordinated market control. Their concern was not only that corporations had invested in transit systems. It was the possibility that those corporations had used those investments to reshape the entire structure of urban transportation. And if that possibility proved true, the consequences would be enormous. Because it would mean that the disappearance of America's electric streetcars might not have been the slow fading of an outdated technology. It might have been the result of a carefully constructed industrial strategy. In 1947, the United States government decided to test that possibility in court. The legal case began quietly in 1947. No dramatic raids. No sudden shutdowns. Just a federal indictment filed in a courtroom. The United States government accused several corporations of conspiring to monopolize parts of the urban transportation market. The list of defendants included General Motors, Standard Oil of California, Firestone Tire and Rubber Company, Phillips Petroleum, Mack Truck, and the holding companies National City Lines and Pacific City Lines. At the center of the case was a simple question. Not whether buses could replace streetcars, but whether powerful suppliers had secretly worked together to control the market for the products used by those buses. The timeline leading to the trial stretched back more than a decade. 1936. National City Lines begins acquiring transit systems in Midwestern cities. 1938. Investment capital arrives from General Motors and Firestone. The holding company gains the financial power to expand. 1939. Standard Oil of California joins the group of investors. Fuel supply agreements begin appearing in company contracts. Early 1940s. Transit systems across multiple cities change hands. Electric streetcar networks that had operated for decades begin shifting toward bus fleets. 1944. Federal investigators begin formally examining the relationships between the investors and the transit companies they funded. The government's argument was not that streetcars were superior technology, nor that buses should never replace them. Instead, prosecutors focused on the structure of the business agreements. According to court records, the companies financing National City Lines had required the transit systems they acquired to purchase their products. General Motors buses. Firestone tires. Fuel from oil companies connected to the investors. The accusation was specific. These corporations had allegedly conspired to monopolize the sale of buses, fuel, and tires to transit companies that they themselves controlled. In other words, they had created a closed commercial loop. Acquire the transit system. Convert it to buses. Supply the buses. Supply the tires. Supply the gasoline. Every step of the transportation process feeding back into the same industrial network. The trial unfolded slowly. Executives testified. Documents were presented. Corporate relationships were examined. By 1949, the court reached its decision. The companies were not convicted of destroying streetcar systems themselves. That charge proved difficult to establish within antitrust law. But the court did find several of them guilty of conspiring to monopolize the sale of bus-related products to the transit companies they controlled. It was a narrow ruling. A technical antitrust violation. The penalties were modest. General Motors was fined $5,000. Other corporations received similarly small penalties. Even at the time, some observers noted the contrast. A case involving the transformation of transportation across dozens of American cities had concluded with fines that were tiny compared to the scale of the industries involved. Yet the ruling confirmed something important. Behind the disappearance of many electric streetcar systems had existed a coordinated web of corporate investment, supply contracts, and transit ownership. Whether that network had intentionally reshaped the entire transportation landscape remained an open question. But the evidence revealed that the transformation had not been as spontaneous as it once appeared. By the end of the 1940s, the courtroom had closed its doors. The verdict was recorded. The fines were paid. The case slowly faded from public attention. Yet the transformation of American transportation continued. Streetcar tracks kept disappearing from city streets. Electric lines that had once hummed above busy avenues were dismantled. Bus fleets expanded across urban networks that had once relied on rail. To many observers, the change still appeared inevitable. Automobiles were becoming symbols of freedom and mobility. Highways were expanding. Suburban neighborhoods spread farther from city centers, often beyond the reach of fixed rail systems built decades earlier. But when historians later began comparing the timeline of these developments, an interesting pattern began to emerge. The shift from electric streetcars to gasoline buses did not occur evenly across all cities. Instead, the most rapid transformations often appeared in places where transit systems had passed through the hands of companies like National City Lines. In Los Angeles, for example, one of the largest electric rail networks in the world had once connected hundreds of miles of track across Southern California. Within a few decades, much of that system had vanished, replaced by bus routes running through increasingly automobile-dominated streets. In other cities, similar sequences unfolded. Transit companies weakened under financial pressure. Holding companies stepped in. Infrastructure was removed. New fleets arrived. Individually, each decision could still be explained by practical reasoning. Buses required less maintenance than rail systems embedded in asphalt. City governments were reluctant to fund expensive infrastructure upgrades. Automobiles were reshaping the design of streets themselves. But when researchers stepped back and looked at the larger picture, certain relationships seemed to repeat. Corporate investment appeared just before major transit conversions. Supply contracts connected manufacturers directly to the transit companies they financed. The industries benefiting most from bus-based transportation were often the same ones providing the capital behind the transitions. None of this proves a single master plan. History rarely moves through simple conspiracies. Instead, what begins to appear is something more subtle. A convergence of incentives. Automobile manufacturers wanted more vehicles on the road. Oil companies benefited from increased fuel consumption. Tire manufacturers profited from every bus, truck, and car that replaced rail-based transit. At the same time, city governments faced mounting costs to maintain aging streetcar infrastructure. When those pressures combined, the result often moved in the same direction. Toward rubber tires. Toward gasoline engines. Toward roads designed primarily for cars. By the 1950s, the automobile had become the central organizing force of American urban life. Highways expanded across the country. Suburbs stretched outward. Public transit systems shrank or disappeared in many regions. Looking back, historians sometimes hesitate to describe the earlier streetcar era as a lost golden age. The systems had problems. Many were financially unstable long before the corporate investments of the 1930s. Yet the sequence of events still raises an intriguing possibility. That the disappearance of electric streetcars may not have been caused by a single decision or a single conspiracy, but by a moment in history when technological change, economic pressure, and corporate strategy all began pointing in the same direction. And once that momentum began, it proved remarkably difficult to reverse. Decades after the tracks disappeared, the memory of the streetcar era still lingered in unexpected places. Sometimes it appeared in old photographs. Sometimes in city maps where faint lines traced routes that no longer existed. And sometimes in the stories told by people who had once ridden them. In Los Angeles, long before the region became synonymous with freeways and traffic, elderly residents occasionally recalled something very different. As children, they had boarded bright red electric cars that carried them across the sprawling basin. The cars glided through orange groves, past quiet neighborhoods, and into the busy center of the city. The ride was smooth, predictable, shared. For many families, the streetcar had been more than transportation. It had been a social space. Workers heading to factories. Students traveling to school. Shoppers carrying parcels home in the evening. Entire communities moved together along the same steel lines, following schedules that shaped daily life. When the streetcars disappeared, the change was not always dramatic. In many places the transition happened gradually. One line replaced with buses. Another route closed. A depot quietly abandoned. Yet the effect slowly reshaped the way cities functioned. Without fixed rail lines anchoring neighborhoods, transit routes became more flexible but also less permanent. Development patterns shifted. Areas once built around streetcar stops lost their central connection to the urban core. And for many people, transportation itself began to change from something shared into something individual. Owning a car was no longer a luxury. It became a necessity. Families that once relied on transit schedules now planned their lives around highways and parking spaces. Commuting distances expanded. Cities stretched outward. Older residents sometimes described the shift with a mixture of nostalgia and confusion. The streetcars had seemed permanent. Their steel tracks had been embedded directly into the pavement. Their wires stretched across the sky. Their stations stood on familiar corners. It was difficult to imagine that something so physically integrated into the city could simply vanish. Yet within a single generation, much of it did. And as those witnesses aged, their memories became one of the few remaining connections to a transportation system that had once carried millions of people every day. Today, in a few places, fragments still survive. A piece of rail uncovered during road construction. An abandoned station tucked between newer buildings. Or an old photograph showing a street where the traffic moved very differently than it does now. Small reminders that the structure of everyday life can change quietly, even when it once seemed fixed in steel. By the early 21st century, the debate had quietly returned. Not in courtrooms this time. But in city councils. In planning offices. In public conversations about traffic, pollution, and the future of urban life. Because the questions surrounding those vanished streetcar systems had begun to feel strangely modern again. Across the United States, cities that once dismantled electric transit networks were now attempting to rebuild them. Light rail lines appeared in places that had removed tracks decades earlier. Streetcars returned to a handful of downtown corridors. Commuter rail systems expanded around major metropolitan areas. Urban planners began studying photographs and maps from the early 20th century, noticing something that earlier generations had overlooked. Many of the routes modern cities were trying to recreate already existed once before. Old streetcar lines had connected neighborhoods in ways that modern bus systems struggled to replicate. The fixed rails had encouraged dense housing and walkable districts. Businesses clustered near stops. Schools, shops, and workplaces often formed along the same corridors. When those rails vanished, the structure of cities changed with them. Historians looking back at the mid-century transition sometimes describe it not as a single event, but as a turning point in how Americans imagined movement itself. The automobile offered freedom, speed, and personal control. For millions of people, it transformed everyday life in ways that felt empowering. Yet that transformation also reshaped the physical environment. Cities stretched outward. Highways divided neighborhoods. Public transit became less central to the daily routine of many communities. And the story of the streetcars, along with the court case involving National City Lines and its corporate investors, began to occupy a curious place in historical discussion. Some scholars interpret the episode as a limited antitrust violation that had only modest influence on a transition that would have happened anyway. Others see it as evidence of how industrial power can quietly steer technological change when financial incentives align. Both perspectives rely on the same fragments of evidence. Court documents. Corporate contracts. Transit maps showing rails that once crossed entire cities. What remains less clear is the deeper question behind those documents. When large systems disappear from everyday life, how much of that change comes from natural technological evolution, and how much emerges from the economic forces guiding it? The answer may not lie in a single verdict. Instead, it lingers in the landscape of American cities themselves, where highways follow paths once shared with streetcars, and where planners now attempt to rebuild pieces of a transportation network that earlier generations allowed to vanish. The rails were removed. But the question they leave behind is harder to dismantle. Years later, if someone walks through certain American cities after a heavy rain, something strange occasionally appears beneath the asphalt. A thin line of steel. A rail. It emerges where the pavement has cracked or where construction crews have peeled back the road surface. For a moment, the past pushes quietly through the present. Drivers pass without noticing. Pedestrians step over it. But the rail is still there. Buried under layers of time. A reminder that the streets were once designed for something very different. Nearly a century ago, those rails carried electric streetcars through hundreds of cities across the United States. They connected neighborhoods. They shaped where homes were built, where businesses opened, where people gathered each day. Then the tracks were removed. The vehicles disappeared. And the streets filled with cars. The court case in 1949 offered only a small glimpse into the forces surrounding that transformation. It confirmed that powerful corporations had coordinated investments, supply chains, and transit ownership in ways that violated antitrust law. Yet the legal decision never fully explained the larger story. History rarely provides clean answers. Technologies rise and fall for many reasons at once. Economic pressure. Political decisions. Cultural dreams about the future. And sometimes the quiet influence of industries that see opportunity in a changing world. The streetcars vanished. But the cities remained. Today, in some places, new rails are being laid again. Modern streetcars glide through downtown districts. Light rail lines stretch toward suburbs that once depended entirely on highways. It is not a return to the past. The world has changed too much for that. Yet when those new trains begin moving through city streets, they follow corridors that often look strangely familiar on old maps. Paths drawn generations earlier by engineers who once imagined cities organized around shared movement rather than individual machines. And beneath many roads, the old rails are still waiting. Silent. Hidden. Patient. A quiet question pressed into the pavement of history. Did the streetcar era end because it was destined to end? Or because, at a particular moment in time, a different future became far more profitable?